Within a vast, mysterious universe, whose origin and future are incomprehensible to human minds, there spins a small planet that houses a variegated human family. Those of us concerned about the right to be variegated are determined to preserve the wall of separation between church and state and the freedoms ensured by the First Amendment to our Constitution, which begins, Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. Food for Thought Productions is pleased to present Mr. Gill Alexander Moegerly, author of a new tell-all book about James Dobson and his Focus on the Family organization.
The religious right has a new militant, moral, and political leader who is responsible in large measure for its continuing power surge, a man now more influential than Pat Robertson or Ralph Reed, about whom you know much, and more influential than was Jerry Falwell in his prime. A man you probably know almost nothing about, and that's exactly because he planned it that way. This is a man who deliberately hides from public and media scrutiny in contrast to Falwell, Robertson, and Reed. He is, according to Barry Lynn, the nation's ultimate stealth crusader. He's a wealthy, powerful head of a Colorado Springs-based international communications empire called Focus on the Family. And I refer, of course, to James Clayton Dobson. By most measurements, the religious right continues to grow in its influence and power. One of the set of statistics that I studied over the last 90 days it shows that in 1988, those leaving the polling booths during the general election, when asked questions about their affiliation or lack of affiliation with what we call the religious right, or specifically the Christian Coalition, or the moral majority, or who term themselves born-again Christians, regular church attenders, who identify with political activism, those saying yes to any questions of that type numbered 18% of the electorate, 1988, almost 1 in 5. Move forward one general election, 1992. Same set of questions, now the response is 24%, almost 1 in 4. Now move to last November. Same set of questions, because this movement is now the object of a great deal of attention and interest. 29%, almost 1 in 3 voters identify in some way with that part of our society. And who leads? Who has the most influence? Who has the most power? Well, of course, we're most familiar with Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed. And if you wanted some type of measurement, some way of quantifying and contrasting Reed and Robertson, you know that Ralph Reed works for Pat Robertson, as opposed to James Dobson, we might do it this way. Several days ago, Reed and the Christian Coalition released a press release stating with great excitement that donations to the Christian Coalition were up 38% in 1996 over any previous year. And what was that dollar amount? $26 million donated last year to the Christian Coalition. From a mailing list of about 1.5 million households, it's hard to say how many individuals are represented by a household. James Dobson finished 1996 raising almost $125 million from a mailing list that tops 4 million households of very, very loyal followers. Perhaps a formal introduction is in order for those of you who, like so many, are rather unfamiliar with this name. James Dobson is a Southern Californian until several years ago when he relocated his organization to Colorado. He's a graduate of the University of Southern California with a PhD in early childhood development. He was for a time an associate clinical professor of pediatrics at the USC School of Medicine. He was for a time on the attending staff of Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. He is a psychologist. He is a licensed marriage, family, and child counselor. And he's the author of 15 best-selling books on the family, the first of which was called Dare to Discipline and written at a time in the 60s when the nation was struggling with the issue of parental authority, and it went screaming right to the top of the bestseller list. All of his books have sold in bestseller numbers, some of them in excess of 1 million copies. Most recently, he has written a book entirely on a political treatise. If you're interested in him and his writings on that subject, the book title is Children at Risk. He is the CEO of Focus on the Family, as you've been told. That is a media giant that we started, 5 or 6 of us, in 1977 with 2 purposes in mind. We wanted to produce electronic and print materials that would help Americans deal with 2 struggles, address 2 concerns and issues. First, maintaining lifelong marriage in a society that is battling with a rising divorce rate. How can we help? Secondly, assisting American parents in raising their children at a time when there seems to be some type of rising anxiety with how we raise our children and deliver them into adulthood healthy and strong, mind and spirit and body. Raising kids, keeping marriages strong. That's what Focus on the Family was all about. Several years later, Dobson added a 3rd dimension, and that's the one we're here to talk about tonight. I have no quarrel with James Dobson, helper of marriages, helper of parents. My quarrel tonight is with James Dobson, political activist. A quick additional introduction of myself. When I met Jim in 1977, I had been in broadcasting for 10 years. I was the vice president of an advertising agency in Chicago that specialized in providing professional services to religious broadcasters. And so I was a producer and a writer, a studio director, an on-air personality. I was familiar with fundraising techniques and how you build a mailing list, and I was a writer and an editor of published materials. We provided all of those services to Dobson when he began. He knew nothing about radio, nothing about mailing lists, nothing about fundraising, and so the team that we had there in Chicago, I now feel sorry to say, gave Dobson his start. Shortly thereafter, I relocated to Southern California and assumed a role of senior vice president as the organization grew, and we wanted many of those services handled inside rather than by an outside agency. So my work has been as a radio and television producer, a syndicator, a writer and editor of published materials, a fundraiser, and working on mailing lists. I served side by side on the senior executive staff for 10 years and as a voting member of the board of directors. I attended virtually every meeting of both of those groups during the first decade of Focus on the Family's existence. So I speak to you tonight with some knowledge of this man. Barry Lynn made a comment to me in a telephone conversation we shared last fall that was a repeat of a comment that I had heard him make on the same ABC television profile in November of 1995. That was something that had never occurred to me until he pointed it out. On the broadcast, Lynn said, quote, "A lot of names in Dobson's database come not because somebody said, 'We seek your advice about legislation.' It's because they called on Dobson in a time of great personal trauma." To which John Hockenberry said, "So Dobson has turned a family crisis hotline into a political army?" And Lynn observed, "That's exactly right." And that is exactly right. You remember we started Focus on the Family to help parents with their kids and to help couples with their marriage. So that almost all Dobson programming and material has an edge to it of crisis management, crisis help. The subject material goes something like this. Are you noticing a strain on your marriage? Are you going through difficult times? We'd like to help. The following half hour is devoted to 3 suggestions for strengthening communication in marriage. The people who hang on that broadcast the most are the people who are on the edge of crisis in their marriage or in the middle of one. The people who respond to that broadcast, who write and ask for more, and there's always a 3-minute appeal at the end of the broadcast to write and ask for more and send a donation, are those who are struggling on the edge of crisis. And what starts to build up over time, whether it's marriage or perhaps a broadcast like last Thursday and Friday's national broadcast, was designed to help parents with teenagers who are struggling intensely with drug addiction. Imagine the feelings of being a parent whose child is struggling with drugs. Dobson is there to help. And as that mailing list grows from people who have received help month after month, can you imagine the feeling on the part of that constituency when Dobson says, now I need your help? There's an issue before Congress that I think will wreck America. Let's move. Powerful, influential, but exactly how dangerous. Again, a Barry Lynn observation. In the conversation that I had with him last fall, he made the following statement to me. James Dobson and Focus on the Family now represent the greatest threat to constitutional liberties in our time. What does that mean? Well, it means, for example, that if you're a woman, you ought to feel a sense of threat and danger from this man. We have here, if you'll allow me to use a couple of quick stereotypes, I know the danger of stereotypes, but if you'll allow me to use them for quickness in communication, we have here the quintessential Southern Bible Belt, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-conservative Christian. And what I mean by that in terms of his danger to women is here we have a man who believes in the principle of male headship in the home. This is a man who believes intensely that God has somehow ordained that as power and authority is divided up in the home, egalitarianism is not the goal. Equality is not the objective. Or even better than that, let's avoid as much division of power as possible. Let's just lead this home, the two of us, shall we? Together. In contrast to any of those views, this is a man who believes that God has somehow uniquely ordained men to exercise higher authority, higher power in the home. And there is no question when he moved from advising people about how to run their homes to advising Washington on how to run the country, he took male headship with him. Women aspiring to serve in the military can expect to be told by this male that that is not a good idea for them. The men will go, thank you, and you should stay home. You should stay in the kitchen. Women who experience the influence of this man can expect to find not a decrease in the glass ceiling, but a thickening of the glass ceiling. I worked side by side with him for 10 years. The senior staff at Focus on the Family was all white and all male. And what troubles me more than that, now that I think back on those years, is that there was never one moment's conversation in that decade where Dobson talked about some vision of gender equality. There was never one word said about the unique and positive influence a woman might bring to that executive cabinet boardroom. If you were a woman, you ought to feel a threat from this man in what is clearly, likely the most talked about issue of our day, and that is abortion. If you have ever envisioned someone on the extreme right on that issue, you have pictured James Dobson. In fact, he is more to the right than when I met him and worked with him. When we started together, Dobson had the classic view that abortion should be outlawed, it's morally wrong for everybody, with three exceptions. If a woman is raped, if a woman is a victim of incest, and if a woman is, if her life or her health is endangered by the pregnancy. To my utter amazement, years later, Dobson changed his position and dropped the three exceptions. Dobson now campaigns for abortion to be outlawed. And the message from James Dobson to the women in this room is, if you are ever raped, that pregnancy must go to the end as well. If you are ever the victim of incest, that pregnancy must go to its end as well. And if your doctor and your spouse ever find yourself in that horrendous conversation where the words are said, this pregnancy may kill you, or this pregnancy may render you to have a medical problem the rest of your life, then if Dobson gets his way, your only choice will be to go to the death on behalf of that pregnancy, even if it means leaving behind young children already born. You have reason to feel a threat from this man. If you are what might be called a civil libertarian, you should feel a threat from this man. And I'm not referring to the institution of libertarianism, but to the philosophy of civil libertarianism. If a good definition is someone who cherishes the notion that as our society evolves, we should do everything in our power to ensure that as many of life's decisions are made by individuals in full freedom as possible, and as few decisions as possible are made by government. If that is a good working definition, then if you believe it, you should feel endangered by this man. This is a man who believes in censorship. He believes, for example, no matter how you feel about Playboy, that it should be on no newsstand in this country, that individuals should not make the decision about accessing erotic material. That should be a decision that is made by a moral code housed in the government in Washington. This is a man who believes that there are two principal social philosophies or principles at work in our country. One is the slippery slope principle, and the other is the need for government intervention principle. The slippery slope philosophy says we're all in moral trouble. We're all quite weak. And the minute we put one foot on some slope, looking at Playboy, buying a lotto ticket, whatever the slope may be, we are on our way to ultimate personal destruction. The slippery slope. And secondly, we need the government to step in and stop us, to keep us from the slope. So this is a man, for example, who believes in outlawing gambling. He believes that if you buy a lotto ticket Wednesday night, you're in danger. You may not recognize it, but you won't be able to control yourself morally. The day will come, just mark it down. The day will come when you will be on Skid Row in Las Vegas, having gambled away the farm. And so the government will intervene and help us. You may not know it, but in the closing days of 1996, the House of Representatives commissioned a brand new government study of gambling in America. They formed a commission. One of the members of the new commission on gambling is James Clayton Dobson. If you believe in the separation of church and state, you ought to feel a threat from this man. This is a man who founded an organization who he said from the beginning and still says has one sole central purpose, and that is to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ. I don't think there's anything wrong with founding an organization to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ. I just think you ought to keep that a religious organization with a clear, distinctive religious purpose. I think the problem we have on our hands here is that a devout Christian, a crusading Christian, a powerful, influential Christian, has decided to do politics in the name of Christianity. That's where we have our threat. This is a man, for example, who believes that our children ought to be praying in our schools each morning, and the prayer ought to be fashioned consistent with the Judeo-Christian ethic. It ought to be, if possible, some type of Christian-oriented prayer. It's not enough to Dobson that we have the most religious society on the face of the earth. It's not enough that your household is as religious and as filled with faith as you and your spouse care for it to be. It's not enough that your children are free to go to your house of worship and enjoy all of the expression of faith there. If our children don't say a prayer Monday through Friday morning in our public schools, then the society is in deep, deep trouble. And if you are homosexual, or if you are the friend of a homosexual, or the parent of a homosexual, you should feel an intense threat from this man. There's a fascinating man campaigning across the country for homosexual concerns by the name of Mel White. He's fascinating precisely because he was once a superstar within Dobson's religious community that is known for its homophobia. Mel White was a writer of books. conservative, evangelical Christian books, highly popular. He was a screenwriter of Christian church films. He was a ghostwriter for Jerry Falwell during Falwell's prime. And then several years ago, Mel White came out of the closet. He described in the most human, the most transparent and honest terms a lifelong struggle to orient himself heterosexually in opposition to some internal forces or internal sense of identity that he had had. Having been married, having sired children, and yet not being able to make peace, despite electroshock therapy even, with the inner struggle. And so finally deciding to lay down the struggle and identify with what he felt on the inside. And since that time, he has been campaigning to try to help conservative, ultra-Orthodox Christians be more sensitive and more compassionate in their language, regardless of their view of homosexuality. And so it was that a remarkable story unfolded in July of 1994 as Mel White traveled to Colorado Springs and did a sit-in on Dobson's front yard. He went because Dobson refused to answer his letters, just flat refused to respect Mel White enough to answer letters that were not debating homosexuality, letters that were not asking Dobson to please change his position on homosexuality, letters that were simply requesting on behalf of Mel's gay brothers and sisters that Dobson drop the inflammatory rhetoric that Mel feels is leading even to the death of some homosexuals in our society. Not just physical abuse, but murder. And so he went and camped out on his front yard. Finally got a hearing, not by Dobson, I'm embarrassed to say for my former friend and colleague, but just by one of his subordinates. And Mel White delivered a message in hand that had been delivered in the letters. Mel told me in a telephone conversation last year about that confrontation, that what he said that day and in those letters, among other things, was Dobson asks his constituents broad, fear-engendering questions without defining his terms, like, quote, here's a Dobsonism. Would you object if your children were routinely indoctrinated in homosexual ideology in the public schools? And of course, White's point is, what's the word indoctrinated mean? It's fairly inflammatory. Our founding fathers had a great deal of wisdom in setting up the system of checks and balances. They didn't know it then, but we now have the most powerful society on the face of the earth. And that means by definition that the people in Washington who handle this power have their hands on the greatest power in the world. And if power corrupts, and it surely does, then a system of checks and balances has kept us strong. The legislative, the executive, the courts. And in recent decades, we have added a fourth branch of government. And I say this respectfully and positively, lest I start to sound like I'm making a joke. I refer to the press. For all of your complaints, whatever they may be, they have helped us share power in a way where people feel accountable. In a system where people feel like they might very well be asked tough questions about what they're doing in secret. I think that as well has been important to our strength. And I'm here to report to you that James Dobson has carried on for 20 years a deliberate strategic plan to avoid that accountability. In fact, Dobson jokes about it, jokes cynically about it in private. He talks about, for example, how he loves to trigger 1 million phone calls and faxes to Washington, picturing it almost like a military strike with the artillery raining in on Capitol Hill. And then he would talk in cabinet meetings about all the senators and representatives and the White House staff running out onto the balcony to try to grab their binoculars and see where the artillery was coming from. And then he would smirk and say, how great to think of them not being able to find us with their binoculars. That, I would argue, is fundamentally un-American. If you would lead us, then you must be accountable to us. And you must offer yourself in response to reasonable questions about what you're doing and why you're doing it. I had the remarkable good fortune of getting an interview with M. Scott Peck, one of my heroes, author of The Road Less Traveled. Had an opportunity to talk to him for 2 hours about the religious right. His central observation about the problem of the religious right is a lack of paradoxical thinking, which is to say, an inability on the part of so many Americans to hold more than one thought in their head, one opposing thought in their head at one time. The idea that we would hold life sacred is a great good as a society. Unborn life and born life, that's a great good. The idea that we would allow a woman the complete moral freedom to decide the abortion issue on her own with her spouse and her doctor, whatever, that's a great good. The idea that the government should stay out of our lives, it's a great good. The idea that we ought to respect doctors more than we do in this age of managed health care. That when a doctor says we need an abortion here, that doctor ought not to be gunned down or threatened in his own home, in his neighborhood. That's a great good. I've just named for you 4 goods. Paradoxical thinking can hold at one time multiple goods and try to weigh them and work with all of them. An extremist thinks about one and only one thing at a time. I think we moderates have to become a bit extreme in our activism if we're going to offset extremism in political activism. And I think lastly, we must all hold the vision and hold the dream of America dear in our hearts. A nation where there's a chair at the table for all, where there's mutual respect for those of differing views, where constructive compromise is our core competency, where consensus building is our bridge over diversity, and a nation served by a non-religious government that ensures full religious freedom to those of all faiths and to those of none.
The Radical Right Christian Coalition, initiated by televangelist politician Pat Robertson, consists of a variety of organizations operating under names that don't reveal their real purposes. The largest is James Dobson's Focus on the Family. Some of the others are Beverly LaHaye's Concerned Women for America, Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum, Lou Sheldon's Traditional Values Coalition, and the burgeoning men's group, Promise Keepers. These are but a few radical right religious organizations operating under innocuous names that have little to do with their real agendas.
We hope you have found this program intellectually stimulating and that you will continue to investigate the ideas raised here. To connect with other like-minded individuals, please contact any of the dozens of free thought organizations, such as the American Humanist Association, American Atheists, the Center for Inquiry, and Atheists United. You may also email the producer directly via leebaker27@gmail.com. This program has been distributed through the courtesy of Atheists United.